Okay, I think we're recording now. So again, let's dive in now. Welcome to this discussion on student debt, the holistic impact on today's young lawyer. The two of us presenting today, I am Chris Jennison. I am currently a special advisor to the student debt team from the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division. The ABA YLD is the largest voluntary bar association of young lawyers in the country. And in my day job, I'm a federal government litigator, so this is in a volunteer capacity. With me as well, I have Tiffany Cochran, who is the Managing Director of Research and Strategic Implementation for Access Lex Institute, which is a nonprofit that Tiffany can put in much better words, but essentially is looking to make legal education much better for law schools and for law students. We are going to dive, as I mentioned before we start recording, into a survey that was conducted between Access Lex and the ABA YLD. And Tiffany, do you want to tee that up?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And you put Access Lex into perfect phrasing. We are all about empowering the next generation of lawyers. And so this report really fits in neatly with our mission. As Chris mentioned, Access Lex Institute had the pleasure of working with the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division last year to survey its membership about student debt and how debt is impacting their everyday lives. And we learned a lot of rich information from the responses that we received. So we had over 1,300 members respond to the survey, 90% of whom are those who borrowed for their legal or prior education. And this might be somewhat overrepresentative of borrowers that we might find if we survey the entire population of recent law graduates. But given the topic, it's not surprising that we had such an overwhelming response from those who borrowed and are directly impacted by this issue. So we think this is actually really beneficial to us and means that we got a lot of rich information from the survey results. As Chris mentioned, we're short on time today, so I'm only going to give you a slice of the findings that came from a much richer report that we published a few months ago. And that report is available on the ABA's website, along with a recording of a much lengthier discussion we had about the report at the ABA Student Debt Week of Action event. So again, I encourage you all to take a look at those resources when you have time. So let's dive into the survey findings. The first bits of information I want to share with you are really giving you some information about the debt landscape and the amount of debt that today's young lawyer is taking on. So first, when we looked at the responses that we received from the survey, we found that overwhelmingly, most people are having to borrow for their legal education in terms of, those borrowers that we found in our sample. And half of them, or nearly half of them, reported borrowing more than $100,000 in debt to finance their legal education. So these debt amounts that I'm sharing with you on the screen are the amounts that respondents reported having when they graduated law school. You'll also see that this information is broken out by race ethnicity. And so when we look at the various racial ethnic backgrounds of respondents and what their debt load looks like, there are some variations that we observe. 2/3 of Black African-American respondents reported borrowing more than $100,000 to finance their legal education. You'll also notice that 0% reported not having debt at the time they graduated law school. So this means that not only are Black African-American respondents borrowing at higher amounts, but they also appear to be borrowing at higher rates. And so this is something that we should be keeping in mind from a policy and advocacy standpoint when we think about various interventions that will address the student debt equation, as well as law school affordability and higher education affordability more broadly. We have to think equitably about the interventions that we're advocating for. Law school debt is not necessarily the end of the equation in terms of borrowing. After these respondents graduated law school, in some cases, they had to take on additional debt to finance their bar preparation period. As some of you may know, federal loans do not extend beyond graduation. So if you still have living expenses and other expenses that you need support financing, then you have to go to the private market for that and obtain a bar loan. And so here we find that 30% of respondents reported taking on a bar loan after they graduated law school. And then again, we have some variation that we see by race ethnicity. So among those who identified as multiracial or Hispanic or Latina, or those who came from indigenous backgrounds, we find that they have the highest borrowing rates. But I also want you to pay attention to the amounts borrowed. And so again, when we look at Black African-American respondents, we don't see the borrowing rates as high here, but we do see that among those who borrowed for their bar prep period, they were more likely to borrow at the highest amount, so more than $5,000. And again, because these are private loans, you have to keep in mind too that the threshold for credit worthiness is much higher in the private market. So in some cases, these borrowing rates may not necessarily reflect need. It could be that there are more respondents in the sample who would have taken on a bar loan if they had been able to qualify for one. We also find that 42% of respondents reported that they have not been able to pay down their law school debt balances since graduation. And more specifically, we find that 27% of those who responded to the survey reported that their debt balances have actually increased since they graduated law school. And again, we see some variation by race ethnicity on this graph. And specifically, again, want to call attention to Black African American respondents. 44% of them reported that their debt balances have since grown in comparison to when they graduated law school. We were curious to understand why are these debt balances growing and what are some of the reasons why recent law graduates are having trouble paying down these debt balances. And the majority of those who answered this question as to what's driving this increase or rather driving their inability to pay down these debt balances, most of them are attributing it to being in an income-based repayment plan where their monthly payments are not enough to cover the principal. And so this is something that we really want to think about, again, from a policy intervention standpoint, that I know both Access Lex and the American Bar Association are very keenly focused on and are advocating for some improvements here. We were also curious about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. In our survey, we found that a third of respondents reported that due to their debt, they took a job that was less focused on public service or doing good than they intended when they enrolled in law school. And so this is why having programs like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is really critical. We found that 19% of respondents are actively pursuing public service loan forgiveness. But further, we found that 70% of those who are pursuing PSLF reported that because of the program, it enables them to work in their chosen profession. So this is a really, really great news, I think, particularly for proponents of PSLF, where we know that for graduates where they may not think that these jobs will allow them to make a reasonable income that would then allow them to pay off their debt, that this is something that really continues to encourage them to go down a public service career path. Furthermore, we found that 73% intend to continue working in public service even after their loans have been absolved. And so I think this is another really encouraging statistic about the PSLF program. We also find that debt impedes today's young lawyers from making longer-term financial commitments. And there are a few examples of that, particularly when we think about life milestones that we would expect everyday Americans and certainly well-qualified recent law graduates to be able to pursue. So when we look at certain life milestones, we see that student debt is causing young lawyers to either forego or delay certain things. So 52% of young lawyers who responded to our survey reported that because of their debt, they are deciding not to, or they're delaying the decision to buy a home. And we find similar information or similar results when we talk about having children. So 39%, 31% are saying they're foregoing or delaying buying a car. And 27% reported that they are delaying or foregoing marriage due to their student debt loads. But the encouraging news is that when we examine how respondents are able to achieve these certain life milestones across their graduation year, we see that older graduates, or those who have been in the workforce longer, are more likely to report having actually attained these life milestones. So for example, 62% of those who reported graduating in 2013 or earlier are married, compared to 28% of those who graduated more recently in 2020 or 2021. And similarly, we see that 59% are homeowners and 41% are parents. So again, this is one of those things where it's more likely that these graduates are putting off these decisions as opposed to foregoing them altogether. Chris, anything to add here?
Yeah, if I can just jump in there, what is important to note about these milestones is, yes, it's a check mark, it's a checkbox for individuals that society is labeled as successful, but it's also a threshold by which we, on an academic standpoint, can say that these individuals may or may not be having reached those milestones to also have mental health or reach positions of not being stressed or feeling crunched in every which way. If you are able to have the enjoyment of being a parent or being married or being a homeowner, and having reached that threshold of success, if we're using that as the threshold of success, it is much more likely that with the stress that we all know is present in the legal profession anyways, that you're able to cope with that through some of these outside areas that you have in your life as well. So it's important for us to study this going forward too, to make sure that it is in fact that we can in fact say that the longer out somebody is from a graduation, the more able they are to still achieve these milestones, and that's just a delay or not a complete elimination of those life milestones as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also know that there's tremendous economic benefits that come from us being able to pursue certain life milestones such as these. And it's also just really important that if we think about the health of the profession, is also, in addition to how attractive a legal profession is to prospective law students, we really want to think about these outcomes holistically, which is the whole reason why we have this report. And we know that obviously being married and being a homeowner and being a parent means that you're taking on additional financial responsibilities. And certainly we would hope that those pursuing a law profession would be able to do that. Thank you for chiming in on that, Chris. We also asked survey respondents to weigh in on some reflections on their legal education experience. And we learned a lot of really great information from these questions. So I'll share a few findings with you here as well. First, we find that over half of those who responded to the survey reported that they were not happy with the loan counseling they received when they were in law school. Now, we don't know why, but we really do see this as a ripe opportunity for some improvement in how we prepare graduates, not only for the debt repayment process, but also in informing them about the amounts of debt that they're taking on while they're still enrolled in law school and making those decisions. It's also noteworthy that the American Bar Association recently updated their accreditation standards to require law schools to provide student loan counseling both at the entry point when students first take on that debt and in attending law school, but also again before they graduate. So hopefully this is a number that we'll continue to pay attention to and that will go up as more schools take on this responsibility. We also find that there are some indications that most of those who borrowed for their legal education were not fully aware of the implications of that debt and didn't really make that decision in an informed way. So we found that 53% of those who responded to our survey reported that they disagreed they had a clear understanding of the legal job market when they enrolled in law school. 51% disagreed they had a clear understanding of law school costs and debt. 48% disagreed they understood how much money lawyers make. And 43% disagreed they understand the type of work lawyers do. So again, these are really clear intervention points where we can do a little bit more work to inform pre-law and current students about what they're likely getting into when they make the decision to take on law school debt. Particularly when you think about the cost-benefit equation, it's important that you understand what you're likely to make as a recent law graduate, given the amount of debt you have to take on to attain a JD. We also found in our debt report that those with the highest debt balances were the least likely to report that they had a clear understanding of those topics that I just shared with you. We also found that 58% of those who borrowed reported that they disagreed they understood how their debt would impact their careers and personal lives. And I think this really substantiates all the hard work that we at Access Lex and the American Bar Association Lawyers Division undertook to complete this survey and to share these results. And hopefully this demystifies a little bit of this information for current and prospective law students. As part of these reflection questions, we also asked respondents to tell us about their levels of satisfaction with various aspects of the decision to attend law school. And we see that across the board, these percentages of satisfaction drop with the amount of debt that folks took on to attain their JD. But overwhelmingly, we find that across the board, most would say that they would still get a JD if they had the opportunity to do it again. But knowing what they know now, they would have chosen a different law school. So now I want to ask you all to weigh in on a quick poll question that we're going to get ginned up here for you. So based on the information that I've shared with you so far, what do you think most young lawyers would have changed about their law school choice if they had the chance to do it again?
And I think that if you haven't seen this poll, it shows up on the right side of your screen, right where the live chat is. It's the second option up from the bottom. So it's the little square with three different sized lines in it. And you can vote there if it doesn't pop up for you.
Yep. And I do see we've had some responses come in. So we're going to give you just another second to answer before we close the poll. All right, Chris, I think that's about time. So among those who voted, you're very smart. So you got it right. We found that overwhelmingly, most people would have selected a more affordable institution. So 58% said they would have chosen a school that offered a better scholarship, and 57% reported they would have chosen to attend a law school that had lower tuition. And there were a few other responses that we received as well. 39% said they would have chosen to attend a more prestigious institution, but overwhelmingly, affordability was really the thing that respondents would have changed. So finally, before I hand it back over to Chris, I just want to share a few resources that AccessLex provides to really try to address some of these critical issues that I've shared with you so far. So the first is we have a wonderful platform called Ask Edna. That's the education network at AccessLex. And among those resources, you can find for both pre-law and current students, currently enrolled law students, a financial education curriculum called MAX. And it really provides wonderful targeted information based on where you are in your legal education trajectory to give you pointed advice about what you should be thinking about from a financial standpoint. And then we also have a number of advocacy tools that we offer through our Make the Case campaign. So our policy team does a wonderful job of making it really, really easy for people who care about student debt issues and higher education affordability issues to advocate their members, their representatives and members of Congress about these issues. And I should also mention that as part of our Ask Edna platform, we have a wonderful team of representatives who are accredited in financial services to be able to provide targeted advice, one-on-one advice about loan repayment options and a wealth of other financial education advice. And so I really encourage you to check those opportunities out. If not for yourselves, certainly share it with others who you think might benefit from those resources as well. So that's a bit about what we're doing at AccessLex to address these issues. And now I want to turn it over to Chris to talk about some of the things that the ABA is doing as well.
Thanks, Tiffany. And I think the survey that you presented on really kind of grounds us as to where we need to focus our efforts as the ABA, as lawyer leaders in the profession, to make the profession better, to make the enormous topic of student debt more manageable, both for policymakers and for everyday lawyers and law students. So if you go to the next slide, there's a couple of actions that the ABA has already taken, led by the ABA Young Lawyers Division. I think many of those on here are aware of kind of the policy process in the ABA, but the way that the ABA can take action on different policy proposals is by passing a policy or passing what's called a resolution through the ABA's House of Delegates, kind of a congress of lawyers from different states and from different affiliate bar associations throughout the country. So the Young Lawyers Division has brought forward a couple of resolutions related to student debt in the last 2 years that are essentially enabling the ABA and the ABA's Government Affairs Office, who puts on ABA Day, to go out and say, lawyers are asking for this, young lawyers are asking for this. So the three actions that we've recently pushed forward as the Young Lawyers Division, the first was in the annual meeting in 2020, so August 2020, Resolution 10D, called for an extension of the forbearance of federally held student loans. So thinking about the timing of that was 5-6 months into the pandemic kind of hitting in the country, and we had already had a brief administrative forbearance period of federally held student loans. We passed that resolution, the ABA House of Delegates passed that resolution, and then shortly thereafter, the administration continued that or extended that forbearance period. And actually, as you may have seen the news, it broke yesterday and was official today. The extension is being continued again. So there's not only as it was extended back in 2020, it's now ongoing. The latest extension is going to be through August 31st of 2022 this year on forbearing any payments owed on your federally held student loans. So it doesn't apply to privately held student loans, only federally held student loans. But that's still a major action and consideration by this administration and the previous administration. Another resolution that we had passed is kind of what we were deeming an umbrella resolution, really kind of overhauling where the ABA was on student debt. The last time that the ABA had kind of taken a major decisive position in student debt was in supporting public service loan forgiveness back when it was initially adopted in the late 2000s. And so we hadn't done a whole lot on a wholesale level. And so this second resolution in 2021, Resolution 106C, had a few different components to it. It called for expanding the eligibility of federal repayment to those who had private loans. So you could refinance your private loans into federal loans. Allow refinancing your federal loans to later, more favorable interest rates. I know interest rates are starting to tick back up, but the interest rates are still very high for many who have federal loans, but you are prohibited from refinancing to lower rates like you can do if you have private loans. So allowing something like that. Expanding eligibility for loans overall, and then including things like income-driven repayment policies. And then the biggest component in this was also calling for suspension or forgiveness of student loans overall. So that is a major step that the ABA has taken forward and has kind of unleashed our ability to engage in broad wholesale discussion of student debt policy. And then the kind of a targeted approach is the last resolution that's on here, Resolution 512 from 2021. And this dealt with dischargeability of student debts in bankruptcy. The U.S. Bankruptcy Code for the last several decades has prohibited generally speaking, has prohibited the ability of those entering bankruptcy proceedings to be able to discharge student loans in bankruptcy unless you could prove an undue hardship test. And it was practically impossible to prove that undue hardship test. And so what this resolution calls for is for Congress to amend the bankruptcy code and remove that undue hardship test. And all of these resolutions have gotten traction or have allowed the ABA, again, to engage in these discussions. On the next two slides, we have some recommendations coming out of the survey that, each of those individual kind of survey points, for example, about the impact of bar loans, results in a specific recommendation here. So take note of these recommendations. Some of these are things that the ABA can do and is doing. Some of these are things that you can take back to your state bar association, to your local legislative leaders, because some of these can be adopted even on the local or state level, not just in Congress or the federal level. So some of the recommendations that we have are to expand access to and awareness of free financial and mental health resources. We know from this survey that student debt is a crushing mental concern for young lawyers and law students. And so we should be expanding access to that counseling that the ABA is now pushing forward in all law schools, but expanding that at the state bar level, at the state level, at the local level, as well as mental health resources as well. We should be continuing to lead and sponsor and support initiatives that holistically foster financial wellness and professional development. As was shown, many people who went into law school didn't understand the scope or the burden of the student debt that they're going to be taking on. So we need to really holistically educate those coming into law school about what the responsibilities and breadth of the debt is that they're going to be undertaking really is. And then the last recommendation on here, and we've kind of hit on it a little bit, is improve and reform federal student aid programs, and especially public service loan forgiveness. You may have seen in the news over the last couple of years, public service loan forgiveness has gotten rightfully criticized in many ways for the lack of the very small number of individuals who applied for PSLF actually getting approved for PSLF. There's a lot of cloudiness and ambiguity in the program and eligibility, and whether individual payments qualified as part of the 120 payments, and where somebody is along in the process towards potential discharging of their student debt. And so the ABA has been at the forefront of pressing for more transparency, more end user accessibility in the process to make sure that it's not as daunting a process as it is. And we're running short on time, so quickly on the next slide. These are recommendations that hit on what we have already raised as part of the survey, but the biggest things on here is making it easier for individuals to discharge their student loans in bankruptcy, increasing literacy, again, of the financial debt that occurs in law school and what salaries are available in the legal market, and then advocating that bar exam expenses, professional licensure expenses, could be included in federal loans as well. So those are the recommendations. Tiffany, I could talk a lot more about this, but if anybody has any questions, I don't see any yet in the chat, but now's the time. We're happy to answer any others, and you can also always reach out to us, and we're happy to chat about this further with you as well. I'm not seeing any questions or hand raised, but you can put it into the chat, or I think down at the bottom of the screen on your Windows, you should be able to raise your hand as well if you want to do it that way. Where can you find resources online? So the ABA has a great website on student debt, which I will drop into the chat. That's a great question, Allison. And then Tiffany also raised some of the resources that Access Lex provides, and we can get that into the chat as well.
Yes, I will drop that into the chat shortly, but I know that we are running into the next panel. And so we really appreciate you all for joining our discussion today. And we hope that we will be able to review the recording and the other resources that we'll be sharing here shortly. Thank you so much.
Thanks.